it's left many communities and many families in the US kind of teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, in many cases, we haven't collapsed. We sort of maintained this illusion that we can get by without a social safety net because we've disproportionately pushed that work onto women to manage instead.
We're so thrilled to be here, so thrilled to welcome Jessica here. And I have a little introduction, and first we'll just start with the basics. Jessica is a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin and an expert on families, schools, and inequalities, and a mom. She is an author of Negotiating Opportunities and a Field Guide to Grad School, the co-author of Qualitative Literacy, and a contributor to the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. And now on to this book. And this book is an important one. There are many great nonfiction books written about important topics that are interesting, insightful, informative, and engrossing. We love to learn, and nonfiction helps us to do that and opens our eyes up to wondrous and troubling things about being human on this earth. But I would contend that it's rarer for nonfiction to really make us feel something. And I can attest that Jessica Calarco's new book, Holding It Together, certainly achieves that. It's a book that deconstructs our institutions and our cultural hegemony, and then drills down to challenge us to look within ourselves at our own biases that consciously or unconsciously contribute to the subjugation of others. And as a result, as you'll read, you'll find yourself frustrated and sad and reflective, but it's the discomfort in those feelings that matter. We must be moved to make change, and this book will move you. Not just by the stories she tells of women struggling within a political and economic system engineered to cause them struggle, but also because the writing is elegant and accessible and effective, and also takes no prisoners. A little punchy too. Our company, Porchlight, has a motto: we believe in books, because we truly believe books can change lives. And it's books like this that can. And we are grateful for the opportunity not just to meet and hear from Jessica, but to read her book and to allow it to move us, to change us, in the hope that it can change things for others for the better. Welcome.
Well, first, thanks. I think this is maybe on, not sure. Is that on? There we go. Okay. Well, first, thank you all for being here tonight. It is such a pleasure to be here and to see, friendly and familiar faces. And thank you to Sally for that lovely introduction. And it's, I'm looking forward to this event. I want to start off by reading a short section of the book from the introduction to give you a sense. I wanted to share a portion that highlights one of those stories that Sally mentioned, and that will hopefully give you a sense of what I'm trying to do here in terms of giving stories that will hopefully resonate with some readers, but also help us to see into the lives of others that might be very different from our own. Okay. Around the world, women carry more of the load than men do, shouldering a disproportionate share of the unpaid caregiving labor, often while also working in underpaid jobs. What sets American women apart is that they're expected to hold it together without the kind of institutionalized support systems on which women in other countries often rely. Consider a young woman that I'll call Akari. One chilly morning in November 2021, I talked to Akari by phone during the brief window she had between dropping off her kids and starting her shift at one of her 3 part-time jobs. Between those 3 jobs, 2 weekday jobs in retail and a weekend shift at a high-tech manufacturing facility, Akari, who's biracial, white, and Japanese, was spending roughly 50 hours a week working, plus another 10 hours a week commuting. Even so, her earnings were typically between $2,800 and $3,000 a month, varying depending on how many hours she could get. That's far less than the roughly $7,300 a month living wage for a household with an adult and 2 children in the Indiana town where Akari and her children live. And it has left Akari with nearly $20,000 in debts and forced her to work so many hours for pay that she rarely gets to spend time with her kids. This wasn't always the case. When I first met Akari in 2019, she was pregnant with her son Ren, staying home full-time with her 2-year-old daughter May, and engaged to her long-term partner Theo, who's white and who was running his own home maintenance business, which brought in about $30,000 a year. Akari had left the workforce when May was born in 2017. At the time, Akari was making less than $10 an hour working in retail, and she calculated that she and Theo would end up with more money at the end of each month if she quit than if she kept her job and paid for full-time childcare. Things were stable for Akari and Theo up until the summer of 2020, when Theo died unexpectedly, the victim of a seemingly random act of gun violence that years later has yet to be explained. The first few months after Theo's death were a blur of grief and government forms. Like roughly half of all US adults, Theo didn't have any life insurance, and the little they had in savings wasn't enough to keep paying rent. Amid pandemic layoffs and with local child care centers closed, Akari had little hope of finding a job, let alone one that would pay all their bills. Relying on family also wasn't an option. Akari's mother had moved back to Japan to live with her own parents after getting divorced when Akari was a teen. So with guidance from a local nonprofit organization, Akari applied for welfare and food stamps. She also got on a wait list for an apartment in a public housing community, and she and the kids moved into a shelter to improve their spot on the list. Relying on public assistance was challenging for Akari emotionally. Growing up in a middle-class suburban family, Akari never knew anyone on welfare, likely because the program's strict eligibility requirements are designed to ensure that only a tiny fraction of Americans receive cash support. Akari had also learned from conservative family members to be skeptical of government dependency. "I believe welfare is temporary," she explained resolutely. "It's not supposed to be a lifestyle. It's other people's tax money. So when you need it, you use it, you appreciate it, but it's not a lifestyle." The lifestyle that Akari could afford on welfare was far from an extravagant one. As a single mother of two in Indiana, the most that Akari could receive in cash welfare benefits was $288 a month. Even with extra support in the form of housing assistance, Medicaid, food stamps, and subsidized preschool and child care, the benefits were rarely enough to make ends meet, and they came wrapped in a lot of red tape. Public housing, for example, came with strict rules about visitors and not leaving the lights on overnight, and food stamps couldn't be used for diapers or wipes, let alone gas or car insurance. Having a vehicle is really difficult if you're on welfare, Akari told me with a sigh. And yet, to keep her meager welfare benefits, Akari was also required to find paid work, which, living in a county where the patchwork bus system was her only option for transportation, meant that she had to find a way to keep paying for her car. In another cruel twist, Akari learned that as soon as she started getting a paycheck of her own, her welfare benefits would be docked each month, dollar for dollar, based on her earnings, and she would get less support through food stamps each month as well. Earning money would mean qualifying for federal and state and earned income tax credits, along with child tax credits, but she would have to use that money to pay the higher costs she would be hit with for other services, like rent and child care, that are priced on a sliding scale. Having to reckon with all those extra costs is how Akari went from being a stay-at-home mom to being on welfare, to having not one, not two, but 3 part-time jobs in the span of a little over a year. The first part-time job that Akari found in the fall of 2020 paid less than $10 an hour, didn't offer employment benefits like health insurance or paid sick leave, and typically only scheduled Akari for a few hours a week. Yet Akari had little choice about which job to take because her children's Head Start preschool program only ran from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. And even if she paid for extended day childcare, the kids still had to be picked up by 6. Akari added a second part-time low-wage retail job in early 2021, but it didn't help all that much. Akari's bosses rarely scheduled her for more than 25 hours a week across both jobs, which meant she was usually bringing home less than $2,000 a month between wages, welfare, and tax credits combined. That money barely covered rent, utilities, childcare, prescriptions, food, gas, and car insurance. When she fell short, which was often, she had to rely on food pantries and pregnancy resource centers just to keep diapers on Ren and make sure they all had enough to eat. The precarity of that arrangement led Akari to add a weekend job in a manufacturing facility in the fall of 2020. On Saturdays and Sundays, Akari would get up at 5 a.m., drive to the plant, and work the line and the heavy machinery from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. both days. The kids, meanwhile, spent weekends at Theo's sister's house. On Friday evenings, Akari would drop off May and Ren, and they would stay with their aunt and cousins through Monday morning, when Akari would pick them up and take them to school. Akari hated that she didn't get to spend the weekends with her kids, but she figured it was better to let them, and Theo's sister and her family, get a good night's sleep rather than disrupt everyone's schedules by dropping the kids off before dawn on weekends or picking them up after they would otherwise be in bed. Theo's sister wouldn't take money from Akari to watch the kids on the weekends, but Akari would give her a bag of beauty products that she could buy at a discount from one of her jobs whenever she had some extra money to spend. As Akari waved goodbye each weekend, she would think of the stability she was trying to build for her children, but she could see on May's and Ren's faces the toll her absence was taking on them. "My daughter," Akari told me, "has PTSD because of her father's death. She went from having a dad who works and being a daddy's girl and having a stay-at-home mom who's always cared for her. And now there's no dad and mom's always working. So in her mind, she lost both parents. That sacrifice, however, didn't leave Akari much better off financially because it pushed her at least partially over the benefits cliff. With income from 3 part-time jobs, Akari suddenly found herself making just a bit too much money to qualify for welfare, food stamps, Head Start, and public housing, and having to pay more for other programs where she was still on the sliding scale. There's really not a nice transition, Akari lamented, adding that in the short term, and from a short-term cost-benefit perspective, she would actually be better off going back on welfare and quitting her new weekend manufacturing job. Yet Akari was aware that the clock was ticking. Even the states with the most generous welfare benefits typically have limits on eligibility. Indiana's cap is 2 years for adults and 5 years for children. Those soft diversion tactics ensure that almost no one stays in the program that long. Welfare is not going to last forever, Akari told me resignedly, and I'm just going to get older. Right now I can work, but what am I going to do when I'm 60, you know? I can't have anything saved up if I'm on welfare. You can't move up, you have to stay within that line. Right now where I'm at, I lost all my welfare services, but if I continue to work, eventually maybe I can get a raise. Akari's story is gutting. Gutting because of the depths of the personal tragedy it contains, and gutting because of how common stories like Akari's are and what those stories portend. That the US not only makes it difficult and demeaning to access what little protection it offers, but also forces women to be the ones who protect their families from precarity and protect the economy from crumbling too.
Thank you for reading that section. It's a wonderful example of how Jessica uses the stories of the women that participated in this research program that you were heading, and really sheds a light on how women are trapped in a system that they are also relied upon to sustain. And so let's back up a little bit first before we dig in further with that. I'm hoping you can share a bit about the origins of the book. In the introduction, you write that you were initially going to write a book about the best laid plans of parenting, which I guess this is the best laid plans of a book plan, right? And that led you to focus on women as a substitute for a robust social safety net. And let's talk about how you came to be the author of this particular book.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So this book, the research for this book, my early work was mostly on inequalities in relationships between families and schools. So I did ethnographic research, oftentimes spending time with families and communities around schools, trying to understand social class differences in kids and families' lives as they related to schooling. In 2014 and 2017, I had my own 2 young kids. And at that point in time, it became, the idea of going back and doing another deep ethnographic study at that point just wasn't going to work life-wise. I, had all kinds of childcare issues, had all kinds of, life issues that got in the way, and that made doing more ethnographic work seem challenging in many respects. And so I wanted to, at the same time, I wanted to get back in the field. I love doing qualitative research and getting to know people. And I designed this project in part because it would be interview-based as opposed to ethnographic, that I'd have a chance to, schedule things in a little bit of a different way, or at least have a little bit more schedule control, and that I could also I worked with a team of graduate and undergraduate students to do the research that went into this book. And at the time, I thought about it as a book of sort of the, what Sally mentioned as the best laid plans of parenting. This idea that people have ideas about the kind of parenting decisions that they plan to make for their children, but life often gets in the way, whether that's because of their circumstances or because their attitudes change about things. And I wanted to understand, what's that like for families as they try to navigate the discrepancies between their ideal, parenting decisions and the realities of actual family life. And how does that vary for women, and for families in different types of circumstances? And so I started with a team of grad and undergraduate students recruiting 250 pregnant women from prenatal clinics in Indiana, where I was a professor at the time. And the plan at first was, so we started by asking them in this really detailed survey about all the kinds of decisions that they planned to make with their new babies, and about half of them already had older kids as well. And then we were planning to follow up with those, and so we started the data collection in 2018 and 2019 is when we were recruiting with that first wave of surveys, and then followed up with those same moms roughly 6 months, every 6 months after that. So it's 6 months and 12 months and 18 months postpartum. And if you're doing the math, the pandemic hit in the middle of our data collection. And so we were still in the field, and it became very apparent very quickly from those interviews that we were doing. We kind of switched everything to Zoom very quickly, or phone for those who didn't have access to internet at home. I mean, just the amount of labor that women were taking on for their families. Not only childcare when schools and childcare centers closed, but they were the ones who, made sure that grandma got her medication or got to see the doctor and kind of scheduled those kinds of things, or the ones who made sure that their neighbors had, food delivered when they were sick, or that their colleagues had someone to fill in for them if they were dealing with caregiving responsibilities, or if they were dealing with, family care responsibilities as well, or got sick in the process. And so it raised for me these questions about how in these moments of crises, how did we come to this point where we would just rely on women to pick up the slack? And that was in so many of the stories that we talked to, women from across the board socioeconomically, couples almost never even talked about who was going to do this work, that it just sort of by default fell to women to pick up those pieces in the process. And so that's part of where the idea for this book started, was wanting to tell this story of like, how did women become our backstop, the ones who are expected to sort of hold it together, especially in these moments of crises where everything falls apart. And that, there was a moment where I thought this might be a hopeful book. I was telling Jennifer earlier today, where we saw Build Back Better, where we saw this set of policies that could have pushed us toward the kind of social safety nets that other countries use as a way to help people manage risk. And so I thought for a very brief window of time that might be the story that I was going to be telling with this book. But as those of you who follow the news are probably well aware, that's not the direction we ended up going, which led me to a place of trying to understand, okay, so why did we not learn from this crisis? And what are the kinds of, and the back half of the book talks about the kinds of myths that we tell ourselves and that we tell each other and that many cultural forces in our society are telling all of us to try to persuade us that we can get by without the real social safety nets that we need and deserve, and that also make it seem kind of logical and natural to rely on women to do this work as opposed to sharing it more equitably across the board as well. And so that's kind of where this book came from in a very roundabout way, exactly to the point of like the best laid plans of research also often go awry.
I think we definitely want to read the other book as well, though, right? Yes, as you mentioned when we were talking earlier, you still have a lot of material and may get back to all of that important work as well. You mentioned that your research was done in Indiana when you were a professor there, and where the majority of women, and you may not say majority perhaps, featured are from rural and small town families, as opposed to sort of liberal, highly educated people, urban dwellers. How did you navigate, how did that inform this book? And then how did you navigate the impact of race and class on gender, on the gender specificity that you are sort of focused on in the book?
Yeah, those are great questions. And so certainly this is, not the typical motherhood story. And that's part of, what made it challenging and then also what I think makes it, valuable in the sense that these are, Akari's story, for example, these are not oftentimes the kinds of stories of motherhood that we hear about in the news, that we hear talked about in sort of, on mommy blogs and things along those lines. When it comes to what the plight of mothers is, we often hear about sort of the, professional, highly educated, East Coast liberal kind of parenting circumstances. And that's was the case for some of the moms that we talked to, even though they were living in Indiana. So, some of them moved away during the study, so there were a few that were living in places like California or New York by the end of the study that we were doing. And some of them had that sort of, what we often think of as a sort of typical challenges of motherhood. But many of them didn't. And many of them were in circumstances where they had far more limited resources, where they were often highly dependent on their communities simply because the resources that they individually had access to were so, limited in and of themselves that they were relying, things like the patchwork bus system is a common phenomenon for rural places that makes things kind of adds layers of complexity when it comes to accessing the limited social safety net programs that do exist, adds time burdens in a way that, certainly we deal with traffic when we're talking about cities, but there's other kinds of time burdens that come into play when it comes to, physically navigating spaces and being able to get to people when you need to. And so that was, I think telling these stories to me is a way to see, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but, also it helps us to better understand the variations in attitudes around motherhood and around, social policies when it comes to why might, for example, some women be willing to vote against the kinds of policies or vote against the politicians who would promote the kinds of social safety net policies that might actually leave them individually better off, and kind of where is that coming from, and why might they, I talk about in the book about, why might women not leave partners who are abusive or who are, in difficult circumstances where they're, where they are deeply unhappy, but where this is the best option that they have. And the kinds of limited resources, the kinds of social isolation that can come with being in kind of deeply rural places can compound those challenges for many women and make it risky to think outside the box, ideologically, and also to leave the kinds of, oftentimes meager but, stable support systems that they have in the circumstances that they find themselves. And so that for me was one of the sort of driving forces for me in telling this. And in terms of race and class and gender, Indiana is, somewhat, it's disproportionately a white state, and that's the case with the interviews that we did as well. And so because of that, I also wanted to contextualize the interview data that we were doing. And so I also did 2 national surveys of parents during the pandemic, one in late 2020 and one in late 2021, early 2022, to better understand kind of how are the patterns that I'm seeing with this Indiana sample, how are they mapping onto broader patterns across different racial groups, across different sociodemographic groups, across even different political attitudes and things along those lines, to sort of see how well does this hold up with broader patterns that exist. And so that for me was a way to sort of have both the deep stories that I can get from talking to people and being embedded in a community myself, while also thinking about how might this both track with and also be different in some ways from what we might hear elsewhere.
So we talked about how this book came to be. Let's talk a little bit about the social safety net that we have in place and how it came to be. And you refer to the DIY society that we have, and you also call it an illusion engineered out of delusions and myths and a pyramid scheme with women, especially mothers, on the bottom. How do you define the DIY society, or if you can define it for others, and why is sustaining that type of society only possible because of the responsibilities we put on women?
Yeah. So essentially, and I kind of alluded to this before, this idea that other countries use social safety nets to help people manage risk. They use taxes and regulations and programs and policies, oftentimes, disproportionately tax burdening wealthy people and corporations, as a way to, help protect people from poverty and precarity, to give people a leg up in reaching economic opportunities, and also to ensure that everyone has the incentive and the time and the energy to take care of, their families, their homes, themselves, participate in a sort of shared project of care. That's part of what other countries do with things like, national health care and things like universal affordable child care, with things like, guaranteed elder care programs, that these help to, protect lots of different facets of life and make life a little bit less risky and a little bit less precarious for families. In the US, and I kind of trace this in the book back to the early 1930s and to the kind of pushback that happened in the wake of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies, that wealthy people and corporations in the US were not super happy about the added, the higher tax burden that came with paying for those kinds of social programs. And here I draw on Naomi Oreskes' work, her book, The Big Myth, which talks about, and Eric Conway is her co-author with that, which talks about, kind of traces the history of neoliberalism, which is essentially this idea that societies don't actually need social safety nets because in the absence of that kind of protection, people will make better choices and keep themselves safe from risk. And this idea was developed by a group of Austrian economists in the 1930s and groups of kind of wealthy business elites with the National Association of Manufacturers actually paid to import those Austrian economists to the US and install them in like elite professorships at places like the University of Chicago, where they went on to train folks like Milton Friedman, who was essentially like the architect of our modern economy, and also is sort of the brains behind things like massive propaganda campaigns that were engineered specifically to promote this kind of neoliberal model of society, this idea that we don't need a social safety net. And that includes things like General Electric Theater was paid for and was paid for by the National Association of Manufacturers and architected in large part by Milton Friedman as a way to persuade Americans that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that we don't actually need a social safety net, that we should be skeptical of government. And this was a way to kind of persuade Americans to buy into this. Now, the problem is that this kind of DIY model, this idea that everyone should be able to, that you shouldn't need a social safety net as long as you make good choices, you should be able to manage risk on your own, it doesn't actually work. all the research tells us that this is not how people respond to precarity. This is not how people respond to risk. And so what this has meant in the context of this DIY kind of model that we've promoted, kind of cutting taxes, slashing holes in the social safety net that we do have, pushing all this risk and responsibility onto families, it's left many communities and many families in the US kind of teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, in many cases, we haven't collapsed. We sort of maintained this illusion that we can get by without a social safety net because we've disproportionately pushed that work onto women to manage instead. So they are, not only the default caregivers, they're the ones doing a disproportionate share of the unpaid caregiving for families, for communities, for children, for the sick, for the elderly, but they're also disproportionately holding the underpaid jobs in our economy, the ones that are simultaneously too labor intensive to be highly profitable in a very sort of market driven economy, but also are so essential that we need to keep them low cost for people that need those services, things like childcare, things like home health care, that really just don't work as private services, as part of a sort of private market, at least a sort of profit focused market. But we need those services, and so the only way to make them viable is to exploit someone's labor, to pay them less than the value of what they're contributing to the economy. And so essentially what this system does, and I talk in the book about how there's sort of this trickle-down cycle. Women who kind of end up responsible for the unpaid caregiving labor, and then by virtue of that unpaid caregiving labor that they are tasked with doing, often get pushed into these underpaid jobs as well. And women in the US hold 70% of the lowest wage jobs in our economy. And oftentimes they're pushed into those jobs because those are the best options available to them because of the kinds of caregiving responsibilities that they have at home. And so it's this sort of, cycles of exploitation that for higher income women, they can opt out of some of this by pushing that labor onto others. But at the same time, the ones who are in the most precarious positions often end up sort of stretched on both ends.
I think Akari's story that you read initially really speaks to that, right? And in the book you write, in our DIY society, the only way to avoid the risk of precarity is to dump that risk downstream, which means we are all complicit in the exploitation of women, even other women. How does the lack of a social safety net pit women against women?
Yeah, and here, I think it's important to note that this is not a story where no one is really winning here. The number of people who are winning in this model is very small, and they are the people at the very, very top of the economic ladder. But there are differences in terms of how heavily the burden of this kind of exploitation falls on different groups of women. And it disproportionately hits people like Akari, people who are from, who don't have a college degree, people who are, oftentimes in very low-wage jobs, people who are in very precarious circumstances, disproportionately low-income women of color in our society who fall into those groups. Women who are a little bit higher up on the spectrum, those who have a college education, those who have higher income jobs, are often able to, try to compete with men, to try to reduce some of the burden that they face within this model. But oftentimes that means relying on the labor of other women to be able to do that work. And in the book, I tell the story of a mom who I call Holly, she's in a same-sex couple partnership, and she and her wife initially planned to divide everything equally. They wanted to both work full-time. They wanted to both, have their daughter in full-time childcare when Holly first got pregnant. That was kind of their plan, was to kind of keep doing everything as equally and equitably as possible. But they ran into the childcare crisis in the sense that the first spot that they could find for childcare for their daughter was when she was 9 months old. And even then it was going to be a part-time spot and not a full-time spot. And this is not an uncommon, it took me a year to find full-time childcare for my own daughter. We were sort of cobbling together, part-time babysitters for as many months as we could manage it. But this is not uncommon at all, given the childcare crisis that we're facing. And so what this meant was that at the time for Holly, she was the lower wage earner in their household. And as that often is the case for women in different gender partners as well. And so it logically made sense for her to be the one to scale back her paid work. And so she started working part-time, and actually was working part-time while also caring for their daughter. And so she's kind of doing double duty at home. And that was, it worked for the first couple months when their daughter was sleeping most of the time, but this was not sustainable. Childcare, remote work is not a substitute for childcare. And that is something that many of the families that we talked to learned both during the pandemic and in other circumstances in their lives. And this was deeply challenging for Holly, and she wanted to get back to full-time work. And ironically, as soon as just a few months after her daughter did finally start childcare, the pandemic hits and the childcare center closes and everything is sort of pushed back to the way it was before. And this was deeply hard for her. And she talked about how when the center finally, her child care center finally reopened, she went into the center director to complain because she was like, look, they opened on short hours. They were only open from, I think it was like 9 to 4 every day, in part because they couldn't find enough staff to open for longer hours than that. And so she goes in to complain to say like, hey, can't you please just find enough people to open for full-time hours? And she essentially got a lesson in the economics of childcare and found out that really what had happened was that the center wasn't able to pay much more than minimum wage. And so they lost most of their staff. Anyone who was experienced was able to go find a better paying job elsewhere. And also these women who were disproportionately, Latina women who were caring for her daughter didn't have health insurance, didn't have access to paid leave, because the center couldn't afford to pay that, despite the fact that, she was paying over $1,000 a month for even part-time care. And so this was, and she felt deeply guilty about this. She talked about like feeling kind of racked with guilt over the fact that, we have these women of color who are taking care of our daughter and we're not taking care of them. And they're kind of in this very precarious situation. And yet at the same time, she talked about how she said, but at the same time, I feel like I'm in such a precarious position myself that if I want to be able to have a full-time job, if I want to be able to save up to afford IVF to have a second kid, we need to be able to afford childcare, and this is the only way to make this work. And so she said, in the end, you just feel like you have to just sort of hoard whatever opportunities you can get and just sort of sit on top of them. And it was, and that was the kind of story that, not everyone kind of mentally grappled with that. A lot of people sort of pushed away the guilt and just pretended it wasn't there, or pretended that they didn't see these systems. But for those who did, I think it was a really hard challenge to grapple with on lots of fronts.
So you mentioned that initially this book was supposed to be a parenting book, a parenthood book, and it sort of morphed into something else, or you took a portion of that. And this book is not isolated to motherhood, but motherhood plays a big part in it, as we've already talked with childcare and other of the demands that come when you have children. And if you can talk a little bit about how the U.S. renders women as mothers in waiting and what the long-term effects of that is over time. And then we'll, talk about some other of the risks that come with that.
Yeah, and so, certainly, and we were talking before about how anyone can get pushed into this kind of exploitation, and that it's certainly possible for men, for people of any gender, to end up in this kind of situation where you are disproportionately responsible for the work of care. But what we've figured out in the US is that one of the most effective ways to push people into this kind of exploitation is to task them with responsibility for caring for children. Because if you think about this DIY model, the whole idea is you should be able to take care of yourself. But kids can't take care of themselves, they physically can't. And so if someone else has to be responsible for them, and then if you leave that person who is responsible for caring for the children without anywhere to turn for support, then it becomes very easy for them to then have to, take whatever paid job they can get, or, be dependent on someone else who can, the partner at home, for example, or the partner who is the primary breadwinner, for example, if they're in that kind of a situation. And so being the one who is tasked with caring for children can then make it easier to kind of push women into lots of different exploitative types of circumstances, unpaid or paid. And then also, once women are the ones home caring for the children, it becomes very easy to look to them to be the ones who take on the other work for other people in their families and their communities as well. And I tell the story in the book of a woman that I call Patricia, who's she was the default caregiver for her kids, in part because she's a low-income Black mom, and she was able to work from home even before the pandemic. She'd intentionally taken this job as a customer service agent because it was the best work-from-home job she could find, and that meant she didn't have to pay for after-school care for her kids that were in elementary school, and she could sort of, snow days were easier, all these things. But when the pandemic hit, this meant that she took over, full-time childcare for her 2 elementary-age kids and for her toddler, and her husband was a construction laborer, so he's still leaving the house for work every day, and so this just all falls to her, and this was deeply challenging. She talked about the guilt that she felt at the end of every day. She talked about how she's like, I need to not clock out mentally as a mother too when I clock out of my kind of paid job at the end of the day, and this was, and so she decides during the pandemic to cut back to just 4 days a week of paid work instead of 5. And she hoped that she could have that extra day off to have some time to breathe and to spend more time with her kids. And she'd actually become unexpectedly pregnant with twins during the pregnancy. during the pandemic. So she's also just like physically exhausted. And so, but what ends up happening is, so she lived in Indianapolis, and she was one of the more urban dwelling moms in the sample. And her extended family, she was one of the only people in her family with a car. With a reliable vehicle that she could use to get around. And Indianapolis was recently rated as the worst city in the US for public transit. And so pretty much the only other option, and this was, at the height of COVID too, in the sense that she's worried. So her extended family starts saying like, hey, can you use this extra day off to take us to the grocery store or to drive us to doctor's appointments? And she felt like she couldn't say no. She felt like she couldn't, she worried about like, I'm their last resort, like I'm the best option that they have. And she also worried about, if I say no to them, like, then what if I need help? And unfortunately, that is what ended up happening. She and her husband ended up divorcing just before the twins were born. It just got to be sort of too much. And so at that point, and she ended up having a C-section with the twins and needed to be driven around herself. And so she had to rely on those same people to then, drive her around in her car to get to doctor's appointments. And she felt kind of grateful in a sort of ironic way that she hadn't pushed them away before. And I think it kind of goes to show kind of how easy it is, once we sort of put women in these situations where they are responsible for the caregiving for others, it kind of makes it easier to then lump on additional caregiving responsibilities on top of childcare, and this can happen in lots of different configurations. But sort of the more precarity that you are in, the easier it is to become, to fall into more precarity, particularly if you are, the one person who seems like you're holding it together in the process as well.
I remember in my notes, I wrote, Patricia, wow. Because just the enormity of what she was taking on. And she, at least as she comes through your page, seems incredibly not only competent, but also positive in a way that is astonishing to me. And it's ironic, too, that I was like, wow, she's amazing, she's a hero. But that's exactly your point, right? Is that what she had to do should not have been fully required of her to do. And then I believe you say it a number of different ways, but the gift of being able to perform just means you're asked to perform more. Yes. And so we add so much onto the women who are already proving that they are capable of providing this safety net. So the other thing I was going to say about Patricia is the fact that Patricia, Akari, Holly, that you've talked about, one of the wonderful things about your book is the fact that you bring them to life in the book for us. But for a lot of people, there is an internalized stigma of governmental dependency, and we have all of these sort of internalized stereotypes and prejudices. And can we talk a little bit about where those come from, how they play out, and how they really serve to keep women trapped?
Yeah, very much so. And so certainly in the US, we do have a social safety net, but it's a very small and meager one, like that $288 a month that Akari can get for herself and her kids from welfare. And really, the social safety net, part of what keeping it sort of that small and meager does is that it allows it to be stigmatized. When other countries make things like healthcare universally available to everyone, they make childcare universally available and affordable for everyone. In the US, we say that, you can have those things, but only if you are in a very, very low income situation, and only if you jump through 10,000 hoops to drug tests, having to fill out dozens of forms, having to re-up for eligibility, having to make sure that you have all of the having to work requirements like we saw with Akari with welfare. There's all kinds of hoops that you have to jump through to even if you have the income qualification, to then prove that you deserve this support, and go through the rigmarole of proving that you deserve to maintain this support as well. And that work of navigating the system, what Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan call the administrative burden of our welfare state, is that falls to women as well, in part because the kinds of social safety net programs that we do have are tailored primarily for low-income mothers, single moms with children. But there's a stigma that comes attached to that too, in part that we have also amplified as a society, that we've attached, instead of saying that everyone deserves this kind of dignity, everyone deserves this kind of support, we wrap this up in sort of, racist and classist and sexist ideas about deservingness, and we penalize people, and we kind of encourage. I talk in the book about this mom that I call April, who's a white evangelical Christian mom, who, her family is not particularly well off. She's a stay-at-home mom, and they get by on about $30,000 a year from her husband's income as a pastor at their church. And yet she, when I talked to her, one of the things I did with all the moms that we talked to, we gave them sort of surveys that asked them about their attitudes around things like meritocracy. So like, do you think that people, in the US, do you believe that hard work and, the right attitude are enough to be successful, or do you think that for most people, that's not enough and that you need support? And so every single question that we asked her like that, she picked like the sort of meritocracy answer, and she also, with every question that we asked, opposed all the social safety net offerings that I threw at her. Universal health care, no. Universal child care, no. Universal paid family leave, no. Opposed every single one. And digging into this, what I found with her and with many other women in similar circumstances was that they opposed social safety net programs as a way to maintain their sense of moral superiority over people just a little bit lower on the socioeconomic ladder than themselves. And she talked about how, she insisted during the pandemic, she's like, we didn't need, they cashed the stimulus checks. We didn't need the stimulus checks because, I was making frugal choices. I was used to living on a relatively low income. I wasn't going out getting my nails done. I wasn't going out hiring babysitters, going out partying, drawing on, stereotypical tropes to make this argument that she was morally, upright in her choices in ways that she was implying that other women were not. And she also went on to critique. She had, before marriage, worked for a religious nonprofit organization that was designed to sort of strengthen families. It was sort of, she talked about it as sort of a program that was designed to help keep kids out of foster care. But she had a lot of judgments of the mothers that she worked with in this program, oftentimes Black and Latina mothers, low-income single moms, and she, saw herself as a superior mother to them, and used this as a way to sort of drive a wedge and to say that, if they're relying on this system, they must be making bad choices in a way that she herself perceived to not be. And so she would benefit very directly from all of these types of expansions of a social safety net, but she was able to, but by rejecting them and by believing these kinds of meritocratic ideas about success, she was able to see, her own relative success as the product of her good choices and her hard work, and hold out hope that her family would be, rewarded in the end, even as she was, to some extent, shooting herself in the foot in the short term, in terms of her voting patterns, for example, or her willingness to support these kinds of programs.
So I think that we talked about motherhood, which is a good a bulk of the start of the book, and then you move into sort of the three myths that establish our lack of social safety net. And I think we have talked a little bit here about meritocracy, but of course we can say more about it. But essentially, everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Everybody has an equal chance as long as they work as hard as I do. And then the other two you have is the myth of Mars and Venus, or Mars versus Venus, depending on if you read the John Gray book back in the 90s, or sold it, which I sold a lot of them in bookstore in the 90s, and the myth of supermom, which I think is very interesting and a little different than what we think of it as. Let's touch a little bit on Mars, Venus, and then sort of jump into supermom.
Yeah, so the Mars, Venus myth is taken from the John Gray book, which I remember my parents had a copy that lived in our bathroom in a basket, and I remember when I was probably 10 years old, just reading it for the first time and being like, what is this? But anyway, and so, it gets at this idea, the premise of that book and the sort of basis of this myth is that men and women are sort of, inherently distinct creatures with very different temperaments, very different suitabilities, and it gets at this idea, and it's this idea that's been very sticky in our culture, in part because of how it's promoted, by books like that, and also by lots of other messaging that we hear in our culture. The recent, for those of you who followed the news story, the Harrison Butker, graduation speech kind of thing. This idea that women are just happiest at home. It's better for everyone. It's better for the kids if women are at home. Men are better suited for paid work. Women are better suited for caregiving. There's this perception that we have this sort of very neatly organized gendered society that's rooted in biological sex and that leads to these different proclivities. And this has been widely debunked by scholars. Even things like, I talk in the book about research showing showing that things like the hunter-gatherer, the idea that women were the gatherers and men were the hunters, this has actually even been debunked by recent anthropological work, which has gone back through the record and shown that actually, no, women have been hunting this whole time. It's just not often talked about. It's like hidden in the footnotes of all the stories that are there. It's like, oh, and there's also these women that are hunting, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to tell the main story here about men being the hunters.
That is who tells the story.
Exactly. And so I go through kind of like why we have reason to question this, but also showing that this is sticky. These kinds of ideas about kind of these gendered myths about who's best for what kinds of jobs have been promoted both to young women, from the time they're old enough to hold a baby doll, and also to young men who are excused from, having to be the caregivers for their siblings, for their neighbors' kids, who aren't, expected to do chores or expected to help around the house to the same extent that young girls are. And this, socializes men and women to believe that, oh, okay, by the time they have their own kids, she's got, 3 decades of childcare experience and he has none. And so it seems like, oh, she must just be naturally better at this than he is. And this allows couples to sort of feel like it's okay to just let men, off the hook when it comes to caregiving, because she actually does know oftentimes more than he does. And it also kind of goes even further. I argue that these kinds of ideas, even for people who are in positions to do better, can make it seem justified for men. It essentially allows men to see themselves as the good guys, even if they are exploiting the women around them. In the context of our broken childcare system, there are many couples who struggled to either afford childcare or pay for or find even childcare, even if they could afford it. And in those contexts, because of things like gender pay gaps, it was often women who it made more sense financially for them to be the ones to quit their jobs, to scale back their paid work, those kinds of things. And men in those households didn't want to see themselves as bad guys. They didn't want to see themselves as exploiting women if their wives or their partners were the ones who were staying home or kind of taking a step back work-wise. And buying into these kinds of mythical ideologies, believing, oh, well, it's just, she's actually happier at home, or she didn't actually like her job all that much in the first place, or her job paid so little. This was a common one. Like her job, she was only making dirt, so why would she want to keep that job anyway? That was a quote from one dad. And it allows them to feel like they are, the heroes to some extent, in terms of, they don't have to feel bad about the fact that these kinds of exploitative relationships exist in the context of their own lives. And so I talk about both the kinds of cultural forces, the Andrew Tates of the world that are promoting these kinds of ideas, but also the willingness that men have to buy into this, and also data showing from those kind of national surveys that I did, data showing that the men who buy into this also disproportionately reject the need for stronger social safety nets. That the men who, and there's some troubling data that isn't in the book, so Ipsos does these annual surveys of men both in the US and internationally every year for International Women's Day, and asks men about sort of their attitudes around feminism, their attitudes around gender, these kinds of things. And what they've been showing is a sort of increase in the last couple of years in sexist attitudes, particularly among young men. That Gen Z and millennial men are actually now more sexist than their older counterparts. That they are more likely to believe that feminism has gone too far and is hurting men, and are more likely to believe that in some of these other types of sexist ideologies. And to me, it's not surprising, in part because in the context of so much precarity, in the context of the sort of, ideal worker pressures that we place on men, there's financial benefits to having a stay-at-home wife, to having someone who does this work for you on the back end, and believing these kinds of myths, makes it seem justified to give themselves the perks of patriarchy, as I talk about them in the book, as opposed to trying to, be a more equal partner, given the risks and the challenges involved.
I think that's the common thread with the 3 myths that you list, is that they serve as justifications, right? And for the myth of supermom, I was really fascinated by this, and this idea that we make mothers the first and last line of defense against the world, against Satan, against their own children's suffering, that it is all up to the woman or the mother to do the work, do the worry work, do the prevention work, all of that. And I just have a little quote here that you said, and speaking as a mother, I think also informs this, right? Mothers matter a lot, but they aren't the only ones who should be protecting children. It gave me the chills even saying that. And so let's talk about the myth of supermom, and ultimately how that also keeps us trapped and doesn't empower us in the way that we often are told that it empowers us.
Yeah, and so so I use supermom myth a little differently than some other books have. And what I'm talking about here is this idea that we tell women that they are the ones who are kind of naturally best suited, or even logistically best suited, to protect their children from harm. And that harm can come in lots of different forms. But the problem with telling women that, you are the last line of defense for your children, you are the ones tasked with keeping them safe, is that it makes women, particularly mothers in particular, vulnerable to fear-based, fear-mongering, essentially, around potential threats to children. And I start in the book by telling the story of kind of linking this back to the 1980s and 1990s and to the sort of satanic panic that happened around childcare in the US, that there were a handful of high-profile stories, vastly overblown, often completely fabricated stories about abuse in childcare centers that were used oftentimes by conservative politicians and pundits to drum up this sort of perception that childcare was not a safe option for children. And this, persuaded many families to pull their kids out of childcare, persuaded many women to rethink their career plans. And this was sort of at the height of women's, mothers' employment at the time, and kind of helped to stem the tide. We saw this sort of plateauing of women's employment in the late 1990s, early 2000s, in the wake of this kind of fear-mongering, which helped to kind of create this lasting perception. And even in the surveys that I did, almost half of US parents with kids under 18 believe that kids are better off with a mother at home full-time than if their mother is working for pay. That's still the attitude today. And I would argue that that's a direct, you can trace that line directly back to the 1980s and 1990s and to this sort of, lingering fear. And many of the women and the men that we talked to, even if they'd never had a bad experience with childcare themselves, and even if they didn't actually know anyone directly who'd ever had a bad childcare experience, they still had this nagging perception that this is not a safe thing for kids. That childcare, it's something that you use only if you don't have any better options. If you don't have extended family who can care for the kids, if you can't care for the kids yourself, it's sort of the last resort option. And this is not the reality. This is not what the data tell us. Childcare is safe for children. It's developmentally good for children. It's great for families. Having access to childcare makes you a better parent because you're more patient. There's lots of ways that this is great for families, great for kids, but we have this lingering perception that kids are not safe in childcare, and that and that it's really only a benefit for mothers and not a benefit for kids. And it's interesting that we actually see things a little bit differently if you talk about preschool versus childcare, but really high quality preschool and high quality childcare, there's really no difference. They are the same thing, just different age kids. But anyway, I digress on that point. So this idea of the supermom it allows women to be trapped by this kind of fear messaging, whether that's fear of childcare, or more recently we've seen echoes of similar kinds of patterns around fear of critical race theory, fear panics around transgender kids. We've seen panics around even things like Tide Pods. There's stuff that we are taught to fear as mothers, and it leads us to be constantly hypervigilant. And oftentimes that pushes us into positions where we're supposed to be willing to sacrifice our bodies, our minds, our time, our employment, to make sure that we're keeping our kids safe, or try to do it all. Try to make sure that we are, even if we're working for pay, we're also supposed to be constantly monitoring that baby monitor thing that they have in the child care center to make sure that our kids are also safe. And it's it keeps us distracted in ways that are designed to keep us from ever getting ahead professionally, and that are designed to help keep us doing that unpaid care work and being the ones who are constantly on call and available in those kinds of ways. And so thinking about how this kind of fear-based messaging comes in many different forms, and I talk about a number of different moms who kind of come to this either from sort of religious types of fear-based messaging to kind of elite professional success-based messaging, and the way that filters down into moms often being the ones who, even if they could demand a better social safety net, even if they could, work to push back against some of this kind of messaging, they're so insularly focused on, let me just make sure that my own kid is safe. Let me do whatever I can to make sure that my own kid has the best possible chances in life because, no one else is looking out for my kid, and I feel like that has to be only on me to do that. It leads us to kind of, misuse our time and our efforts to some extent, or at least use them in ways that that might only have a small benefit for our own kid, but leave existing inequalities intact in the process.
We have about 5 minutes left, so we will leave the suggested solutions and the way that we can model other countries and how they have solidified their social safety net to everyone who is going to read the book, but ask if anyone in the audience has any questions for Jess.
I really appreciate your being here. I really appreciate you writing this book. It's excruciatingly important. And my question is,
Yep. Oop, you might. There we go. Yes, there you go.
not to talk to you, but my question is that what I'm wondering about is that not only do mothers, we find ourselves as women, as mothers, mothering the world, whether we have biological children of our own or our children are our communities. Mm-hmm. And what I will never understand is, where are the men? Mm. Why is it mothering and not parenting? Mm-hmm. Why is it still the case that we are back managing all of everything, including the unpaid work of social commitments and social organization, from the neighborhood picnic to child care in the most difficult and fragile circumstances? And I know that you don't have time to address the hope that we were hoping would be half of the book, but so that's another book for you to write soon. But where is the hope? Where can we find the help at the top of the falls instead of finding the bodies at the bottom of the falls?
Yeah, those are great questions. So thank you. Yeah, and I think to the point about where are the men, I think part of it comes from the fact that we live in a sort of not only a capitalistic economy, but a sort of market-driven, profit-driven, financialized economy where the types of labor that are valuable are those that not only generate profits, but are going to generate increasing levels of profits every year for every company, that all of our retirements are dependent on now. And so, I think in that system, there is incentive for men, to use whatever privilege they do have to try to pursue the kinds of jobs that are disproportionately valuable because of the way that we structure our economy, because we put so much emphasis on the profits that can be made for shareholders and for those who are lucky enough to have some money invested in the stock market. Then for those, and essentially it's the kinds of work that don't work in a profit-driven economy that fall to women. It's the unpaid caregiving labor. It's the labor that is too labor-intensive and too necessary to be highly profitable, even when it's a huge slice of the economy. Things like most care work, even things like K-12 teaching, we subsidize it a little bit, but we under-subsidize it in ways that, leave it work that gets left to women because it's not valuable in those kinds of ways. And so I think that's, part of where the men is. It's a factor of the way that we've structured our economy and the kinds of work that gets left to women. In terms of the hope, I'll say here that where I see hope is in the possibility of rejecting these myths and coming together to see how, and one of the ways that I argue in the book that we can start to reject those myths is by seeing how care connects all of us, that all of us at some point in our lives will be people who both need care and probably will give care to others. And so I talk about the ideal of a kind of union of care, that we know from research on labor unions that labor unions are great at getting people to recognize their shared identities, even across racial differences, class differences, gender differences. But the problem with labor unions, though, is that they're paid labor focused, and so they're leaving out huge swaths of the economy, and they're also often very focused in particular, industries and things along those lines. And so what I argue is that if we focus instead on how care unites us and how it links our fates, that if a child care provider gets sick, it not only impacts her and her immediate family, but all the families that she cares for, all of their coworkers, all of their, all of the people that and so it ripples out in ways that impact our whole economy. And so if we can remember that, if we can focus on that and see how care links our fates, it can give us a chance to push back against those myths that are designed to kind of delude us into believing that we don't need a social safety net and keep us divided by race and class and gender and politics and religion and all the other things in ways that keep us from coming together to fight for a better social safety net. Because at least for now, we live in a democracy, and so we have enough people that we could demand better policies if enough of us are willing to kind of reject those myths and come together. But that's where I see at least a little bit of hope. Yeah, thanks.
It looks like we are wrapping up. Yes. And so I think the one last thing that I would say is one piece of hope that we can bring away from this is the fact that books like this exist. and we're having conversations like this. So thank you very much. Thank you for your book, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, and thank you all. And thank you so much, Sally. This was lovely. Thank you.